This episode is dedicated to Peter Richard Giulioni by his great-grandchildren Ruby, Theo, and Hank Gehagen. Just days after this war began back in July, the North Korean forces took Seoul, the capital of the South. This week, the UN forces take it back. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week, U.S. 10th Corps, which landed at Incheon 2 weeks ago, advanced on Seoul, and the battle for that city began. In the south, the UN forces not only broke out from the Busan perimeter, where they'd been held for 6 weeks, but broke out in huge force, causing a real meltdown of the KPA, the North Korean army. That really continues this week in large parts of South Korea. The American forces that broke out of the perimeter are heading north and west all week. Songju fell at the end of last week, Gimcheon this week on the 25th, and Yeongdong the 26th. The 27th, though, the KPA fights a delaying action before Daejeon, holding off the 19th Infantry outside Okcheon, allowing at least a couple thousand North Korean soldiers to escape Daejeon to the north. The city falls the 28th, and U.S. 24th Division sets up its command post there the following day. As for the continuing atrocities of the war, an account of the breakout and pursuit would not be complete without at least a brief description of the grisly evidence that came to light at the time. Everywhere, the advancing columns found evidence of atrocities as the North Koreans hurried to liquidate political and military prisoners held in jails before they themselves retreated. At Sacheon, the North Koreans burned the jail, causing some 280 South Korean police, government officials, and landowners held in it to perish. At Anhui, at Mokpo, at Gongju, at Hamyang, at Cheonju, mass burial trenches containing the bodies of hundreds of victims, including some women and children, were found. And near the Daejeon airstrip, the bodies of about 500 ROK soldiers, hands tied behind their backs, lay in evidence of mass killing and burial. In Daejeon, some 5,000 to 7,000 Korean civilians have been killed, and at least 40 American POWs. These killings apparently began on the 23rd, when the UN forces were streaming across the Naktong River and breaking out of the perimeter. Anyhow, George Peplo's 38th Infantry advances 50 kilometers on the 25th, heading west. They storm in, through, and beyond the North Korean 2nd Division, who abandon all their vehicles and heavy equipment, all the artillery, and disappear into the hills where they will try to operate as guerrillas. 38th hits Gyeochang and hits it hard, taking a field hospital, then getting orders to attack west towards Jeonju. They board their trucks at 4 a.m. September 28th, and at 1:30, just 9.5 hours and over 100 kilometers later, have closed in on it. After a brief fight, they take the city. But now, they're deep inside enemy territory. They passed thousands and thousands of North Koreans along the road to get there, and they've run out of gas. They have a bit of a lucky break, though, shortly after arrival, when a U.S. 2nd Division liaison plane flies over them. The pilot is astonished to see them there, and when they radio him that they are out of gas, both 2nd Division and 9th Corps headquarters have gasoline trucks on the road in short order. On the 29th, 38th Infantry is fueled up and on the road again. The American forces, well supplied with vehicles, with many good roads in this part of Korea, were advancing faster than the enemy could flee. General Walker's orders for the pursuit and exploitation had instructed the divisions to forget about their flanks, to press ahead against a beaten enemy, and this tactic was paying off. We did see Task Force Lynch halt their advance northward at Poon as last week ended. They are the lead unit of Task Force 777, so named because the infantry, artillery, and armor all have 7s in their designations. Well, Task Force Lynch gets moving again early the 26th. They make 100 kilometers before late afternoon, but then their tanks run out of gas. I will let James Stokesbury describe the rest of the day. Refueled from their own spare cans in trucks, and in 3 North Korean trucks that blundered into them, they kept on once more. After dark, they reached Chonan and found it full of communist soldiers. Here, they connected with the main highway to Seoul, and the commander of the lead tank asked a surprised North Korean soldier for directions. Put on the right road, they barreled up the highway, getting progressively more strung out, with a trail of astonished, fearful, or bemused North Koreans in their wake. South of Olsson, the Americans passed through a force of communist T-34 tanks and above it through the front lines of the enemy facing northward against the advance of 10th Corps. They link up at 10:26 that night with elements of 10th Corps advancing out from Incheon. Task Force Lynch has gone like 160 kilometers since this morning, mainly through the enemy. They are actually just about on the exact spot where Task Force Smith, the first American troops to encounter the KPA, did so back on July 5th. So, the connection between forces is now complete. As for the 10th Corps advance on Seoul, we saw at the end of last week that D Company from the 2nd Battalion 5th Marines attacked Hill 66. This was in the center of the enemy positions, and when they captured it, it did indeed unhinge the whole enemy defense, though they took 85% casualties taking it, which they finally did with a bayonet charge by the 30 or so men they still had standing. As this week gets going, the entire KPA hill line breaks and they withdraw, leaving 1,200 of their dead behind them. That day, the 25th, there are Marines in Seoul. They haven't taken it, but that night 10th Corps Commander Edward Almond announces that they have. This is symbolic. It's 3 months to the day since the North Korean invasion of the South began. It is also very much premature, because there is no guarantee Seoul will suddenly fall. The Americans had little superiority in numbers. Their advantage lay in hardware and firepower. The North Koreans had the advantage of fighting defensively. In an urban situation, when street fighting was required, that was no small asset. That meant that the fighting would be difficult and costly, much of it block by block, and that, because of American dependence on heavy weaponry, much of the city was sure to be turned into rubble. But as the offensive slowed, as each 100 yards of ground became dearer, the pressure grew on Smith, and Almond became more aggressive, reflecting pressure from MacArthur. Smith is O.P. Smith, who commands the 1st Marine Division, part of Almond's Corps. There has been a lot of tension between the two. It does not get better this week. In fact, Almond, who isn't happy with the pace of advance, actually flies around in a spotter plane acting as divisional commander. Seriously, he gives orders to the battalion and even company-level commanders in Smith's division, but without going through Smith and division command. He was sure that he was a brilliant tactical officer, and he flew over the battlefield, radioing instructions to whatever unit he spotted below him. Smith protested angrily about Almond's intrusion into his command. "If you give your orders to me, I'll see that they are carried out," he told Almond at one point. But it made no difference. Almond continued to direct Smith's men. Almond's code name was Fitzgerald, and finally Smith issued orders to Colonel Alpha Bowser, his G3, that he was not to accept any more orders during battle from Fitzgerald without confirmation from division. There are enemy troops withdrawing, but there are also those that are ordered to make a last stand. This is complicated for them by the ROK 17th Regiment taking the hills that dominate the highway east of the city, and the U.S. 32nd Infantry taking the South Mountain. On the 26th, the fight in the city moves from street to street, and Douglas MacArthur issues UN Command Communique number 5, which says that Seoul has been recaptured or liberated, or whatever you want to call it. The next 2 days still see heavy fighting for the city, which is not mentioned in any further communiques, and the city gets further and further wrecked. The Battle of the Barricades continued. In the middle part of Seoul, the barricades stretched across the streets from side to side and were usually placed at intersections. Mostly they were chest high and made of rice and fiber bags filled with earth. From behind them and at their sides, enemy soldiers fired anti-tank guns and swept the streets with machine gun fire. Anti-tank mines belted the streets in front of the barricades. Right. Well, the Marines have a system for destroying them. It begins with aerial bombardment and strafing, then mortars laying down covering fire for engineers to take out the mines, then Pershing tanks driving up to the barricade, breaching it, and wrecking the anti-tank and automatic weapons. Flamethrowers and infantry follow up, mopping up, but this process could take over an hour for a single barricade, which could hold up an entire battalion. On the 27th, the Marines managed to take the government house, and most of the rest of the city does fall into UN forces' hands the 28th. Seoul has been largely destroyed, as has been the relationship between Ned Almond and the Marines. You know, he has, in fact, delivered Seoul to UN Forces Commander Douglas MacArthur nearly on time. But he is very much seen as arrogant and demanding, and has repeatedly sent units forward without worrying that much about whether anyone was watching the flank or if there were any reserves. He was courageous to the point of recklessness and expected everyone else to be. But this attitude was interpreted by many subordinate officers as a callous indifference to casualties and the welfare of his men. He also placed greater emphasis on the quick capture of real estate for psychological or publicity reasons than he did on the creation of a strong line to stop the leakage of the NKPA northward. Thing is, whatever happens in Seoul or anywhere else right now, Incheon was a spectacular success, the high water mark of MacArthur's career, and it opened at least all of South Korea to his forces. MacArthur himself visits the 29th, arriving while big chunks of Seoul are still on fire. He and South Korean President Syngman Rhee arrive at Kimpo Airfield and make their way to Seoul's National Assembly Hall, with the roadways along the route lined by hundreds of thousands of cheering South Koreans. At noon, MacArthur and Rhee enter the packed hall, where up on a platform, Rhee's wife, 8th Army Commander Walton Walker, and some other top American officers are present. MacArthur gives a speech about the liberation, the horrors of war, the horrors of communism, and then says, on behalf of the UN, he is happy to turn power back over to Rhee. Rhee then gets up to speak and offers his gratitude. Now, we have in both the regular episodes, the background specials, and the War Against Humanity episode talked about the brutality not only of the North Koreans, but also of Rhee's government. And I'm not going to go into it again here, but here is something about Rhee's past that I was not specifically aware of. Little, stooped, wrinkled Syngman Rhee rose to speak. The man who had spent the greater part of his life in exile, now aging badly but still active and courageous, for a few seconds could not speak for emotion. He held out his hands in front of him, clenching and unclenching his fingers, and blew on their tips. Only those who knew Syngman Rhee well understood why his hands worked when he was under emotional strain. Over 50 years before, Japanese officers had tortured him by lighting oil paper pushed up under his fingernails, and had finished by smashing his fingertips one by one. Men who knew nothing of Syngman Rhee's harsh years of exile, or of the Japanese torments during the Protectorate, tended to be impatient with Rhee's stubborn anti-Japanese stand in relations between the two countries. But when Rhee merely considered the notion of Japanese fishing boats approaching Korean waters, his fingers hurt. There's further controversy brewing within American command. See, Allman's 10th Corps has not been a part of Walton Walker's 8th Army. It was commanded separately for the Incheon adventure. Walker has been wondering when it's going to be assigned to him to coordinate any further advance northward. On the 26th, MacArthur announces it is not going to be assigned to 8th Army, but will pass into the General Headquarters Reserve and get ready for a GHQ mission. The success at Incheon has kind of changed the whole nature of MacArthur's command, which you can physically see straight off when he arrives on the scene. First, there were some scores to settle. Those who had been for Incheon would be rewarded, and those who had questioned it now had to pay the price for their lack of faith. Walker's pilot, Mike Lynch, watched in disbelief as MacArthur descended from his plane at the newly liberated Kimpo Airfield, walked right past Walton Walker, the 3-star general who had valiantly held his forces together in Pusan, snubbing him completely, only to greet Allman warmly. So, Allman is going to continue to be 10th Corps commander, and also continue to be MacArthur's chief of staff. Meanwhile, the flanking forces south of Seoul from U.S. 7th Infantry Division also advanced this week, taking Olsson the 27th and clearing the area southeast of Seoul by week's end. Also, today, elements of the 5th Marines advance up the Pyongyang Highway as far as the Imjin River, and the 7th Marines head up the Uijeongbu Road to almost no resistance. As for the ROK, the South Korean forces, their advances up the center and the east of the peninsula have kept up with 8th armies, which is pretty impressive considering they're not really motorized and mainly on foot. Walker even says, Too little has been said in praise of the South Korean army, which has performed so magnificently in helping to turn this war from the defensive to the offensive. The ROK 3rd Division, racing up the East Coast, leads all UN forces in advance, and it is less than 10 kilometers below the 38th parallel as September ends. There are really 3 options for how far north to go or to not go. They could all stop at the 38th parallel, the old boundary between North and South, and accept a return to the status quo, knowing they have not only pushed back the incursion, but destroyed the enemy's forces. They could go up to Pyongyang, the northern capital, take that, and then head a little further north towards the neck of the peninsula where it's thinnest and stop there. This would leave a much smaller North Korea with far fewer resources and no war-making capability, and would leave a buffer zone between the UN forces and the Chinese and Soviets. Or they could go all the way to the Yalu River, unite the peninsula, and destroy the enemy regime. This carries the greater risk of intervention by the Chinese or the Soviets. Debate was necessarily short-lived, for the pace of events meant that decisions had to be reached quickly. Syngman Rhee was of course adamant that the advance be continued right to the Yalu, and that his long-standing aim of the unification of the entire peninsula under a democratic government, by which he meant himself, be completed. Remember last week I talked about Harry Truman's directive about how far north to go, and that they would settle for less than complete unification if it was the only way to not disturb the Chinese or the Soviets? Well, I did say that directive was issued before the men went ashore at Incheon 2 weeks ago, and things have changed since then. This week on the 27th, the Joint Chiefs of Staff give MacArthur these instructions. His primary mission is to destroy all North Korean forces. His secondary mission now is to try to unite all of Korea under Syngman Rhee. Also, determine whether the Soviets or Chinese seem likely to intervene, and report any such possibility as it develops. The first 2 are more straightforward than the third. See, that one isn't really a military question, but a political one. FECOM, Far Eastern Command, though, is not an evaluative agency, but a collective one. That's how it's set up. But it has been and continues to now perform evaluations of its collected intelligence, which is military intelligence. So they may know things like how many divisions some country has deployed. But how can they know whether there's any plan to actually use them? That requires political intelligence and dedicated evaluation service. Well, that's as may be. And on the 29th, U.S. Secretary of Defense George Marshall sends MacArthur an eyes-only message that he is free to tactically and strategically cross the 38th parallel. As for Rhee and the South Koreans, does anyone think that they ever considered for a second stopping at the parallel and just restoring the status quo of a few months ago? To quote Fehrenbach again, "It is very doubtful if Syngman Rhee would have obeyed a UN order to stop short of the parallel any more than Abraham Lincoln would have favored an order from foreigners to stop the Grand Army of the Republic on the Potomac after Gettysburg." Rhee has in fact already told the ROK commanders to head north no matter what the Americans do. The UN discusses Korea in detail September 30th. Finally, the General Assembly met already the 19th, but they don't bring up Korea till the 30th. Things are a bit different in the UN at the moment. The Soviets ended their boycott and returned to the Security Council back on August 1st. And Yakov Malik is not just their representative, he has inherited the revolving council presidency for the time being. Well, a resolution about Korea is now introduced, but I will talk about it next week because that is when the debate on it finishes. A final word here about the U.S. decision to advance. In justifying the decision to advance, Acheson argued that aggression must not go unpunished. North Korea cannot be allowed to take refuge behind a surveyor's line. This approach displayed both a reluctance to accept stalemate and a desire to maintain the initiative in the Cold War. If the campaign was abandoned short of victory, Washington would have to negotiate with Moscow. Discussions would take place at the UN, where the U.S. could not be sure of controlling its allies, and where a Korean settlement might be linked with other Asian problems such as Taiwan. At best, Washington might be blamed by Rhee for the continued division of the peninsula and pinned down there while Moscow rebuilt the NKPA. Rather than risk such an outcome, Truman and Atchison were determined to solve the Korean problem on U.S. terms. Atchison also has political considerations. Responding to domestic criticism, he's trying to show firmness and resolve. And of course, any attempt to stop the war short of total victory might well come back to bite him and the Democrats in the November congressional elections. And President Harry Truman is certainly not going to have a public debate with Douglas MacArthur about foreign policy goals coming on the heels of MacArthur's triumph at Incheon. Well, as I said, more on that next week, for this week of the war is now over. With Seoul falling to the UN forces, even though the fight for it has stirred up a bit of a hornet's nest in American command. The UN forces now linked up below Seoul and overrunning the south and heading up to the 38th parallel. 3 other things that happened today as the week ends. Today, Douglas MacArthur demands that North Korea surrender. North Korean leader Kim Il-sung does not reply. Today, in China, Communist leader Mao Zedong says the Chinese people will not tolerate foreign aggression and will not stand aside if the imperialists wantonly invade the territory of their neighbor. And today, elements of the ROK 3rd Division crossed the 38th parallel. As I mentioned at the beginning, this episode is dedicated to Peter Richard Giulioni by his great-grandchildren Ruby Theo and Hank Gehagen. Peter was 22 years old when he was drafted into the U.S. Army in October 1950. A graduate of Baltimore's Mount St. Joseph High School, being conscripted into military service entered Peter's plans of attending law school at the University of Maryland. Instead, he found himself in South Carolina at basic training. He married his wife Betty after completing it, and they enjoyed some time together before his deployment. After first deploying to Japan, Peter arrived in Korea in the winter of 1951, spending that Christmas near the Punch Bowl on Hill 1243, known as No Name Hill. His unit, Fox Company of the 17th Infantry Regiment, part of the 7th Infantry Division, earned a combat infantry badge for the mortar fire they took here. Later, his platoon helped defend against a Chinese attack at a place called Bloody Ridge. In April 1952, his unit was moved to an outpost north of the main line of resistance called Yoke Major. Guarding isolated outposts like Yoke Major was a dangerous mission. During rare mail deliveries there, though, Peter received packages of Italian sausages from his wife in Baltimore, which he always shared with his friends. On June 15, 1952, Peter got word that his wife had given birth to his son. A mobile PX trailer happened to be on Yoke Major that day, and he was able to buy and share cigars to celebrate. Exactly a week later, on June 22nd, Peter was chosen by his platoon leader to help select a machine gun position. As the two were inspecting an area near the platoon command post, one of them stepped on a landmine. Peter's friend Cecil was the first one on the scene and quickly called the medics, but it was too late. Both Peter and his platoon leader were killed by the blast. Peter was 24 years old. He is buried at Baltimore National Cemetery, and his name is on Maryland's Korean War Memorial in Baltimore's Inner Harbor. If you would like to memorialize an episode of this series, you can do so by joining the Time Ghost Army at Brigadier level for 1 year or by making a one-time donation. You can join the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.